Okay, and now I would like to introduce the moderator for our panel titled Social Inequality and Policies of Inclusion and Exclusion. Professor Marci Ybarra is an associate professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. Her research focuses on the impact of public support on the well-being of low-income families. She is currently investigating social policies around welfare reform, childcare, and paid family leave, and how they impact economically disadvantaged families. Professor Ybarra, the mic is yours.
Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Marci Ybarra, as Dean Gorman-Smith said. It's my great pleasure to serve as the moderator for this evening's panel on social inequality, policies of inclusion and exclusion as part of the UChicago China Forum for 2021. So tonight's panel is going to focus on conditions of US and China as global economic leaders who are also each marked by significant inequities, not only in income and wealth, but also in education, work, housing, and social and political representation among marginalized groups in each country. So this evening's panel is going to address different dimensions of inequality in each country while bringing to bear promising policy and practice responses that we can all learn from. Next, I'm going to briefly introduce each panel member, three who are going to be joining us via video. And then they will each discuss from their own research perspective their research as well as policies and practices that might help attenuate inequality in each country. The panel speakers in order are Dr. XIANG Rong, who is an associate professor of sociology and director of the Social Research Institute at Yunnan University. Following Dr. Rong will be Dr. Angela García, who's an assistant professor and sociologist at the Crown Family School, and then followed by Dr. Shantá Robinson, also an assistant professor at the Crown Family School. And then finally, last but not least, Dr. Kaxton Siu, associate professor in the Department of Applied Social Sciences at Kong Polytechnic University. And then we hope will follow a lively and thorough discussion of the presentation. So thank you. And I think Dr. XIANG Rong is joining us via video.
Yes. Yeah. Hello. Hi.
Dr. Rong,
should I start?
Yeah, go ahead and take it away.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you for having me. And my topic is on the bridging the cultural difference, inclusive community development practice for ethnic rural urban migrant women in Southwest China. And as rural urban migration is a challenge for sustainable development goals, making cities, human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And the urban poverty, social exclusion based on gender, ethnicity, class, and equitable access to social public services like citizenships are the issues. And China, like countries in Asia, under rapid growth and challenges. And that's why the huge challenge, poses huge challenges for governments and the social work. And particularly in China, the issues confronting the rural urban migration in China, there's a huge surge in rural urban migration since economic reform. Like 2027 census, there's 1.42 billion. And this population, the urban population, is 12 million increase by 14% in the as compared to 2010. Okay, the migration grew by 69% compared to 2010. So it's more than a quarter of the whole population of China in 22. So the national policy of new urbanization in 14th five-year plan to 65% urban population, which is another 15 million. So the transition from the rural-urban dualism to equitable entitlement to rural and urban basic services regulated by household registration permits with regular employment contract, tenancy agreement, or property ownership. So these the vulnerability of low-income migrants and all that. So under this huge challenge, a huge challenge, and the policy initiatives comes with the initiatives and also brings about the social work development. Since 2006, the Chinese government began to develop social work to address social problems, which wasn't there since before 1978. Okay, so the Chinese government since 2012, the Chinese government implemented a number of measures to narrow those income inequalities, such as pro-peasant subsidies, poverty alleviation, and social security programs. In 2017, the 19th Congress of Chinese Communists resolved the principal social contradiction of China is that between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. It laid the ideological political foundation of the progressive social policy and social governance of the Chinese government. And this year, actually, just one month before, President Xi further pronounced the Chinese entering the new era of shared prosperity or inclusive affluence with the third income distribution through philanthropy. So under this policy initiatives to address the problems that migrants faced, about now up to 1.5 million professional or paraprofessional social workers to address the issues of inequality, and among them, 3/4 works in the communities and the rural urban migrants. In our case, we're based in Yunnan, in China, and we've been since 2005, we began to work with migrants in social work to develop the kind of service model to address the migration issue. So, and for the first few years, like between 2010 and 13, we adopt conventional social strategies, providing basic services and facilitating social networks among migrant children, women, workers, and such as children's center, the school social work in migrant children's schools, community outreach services, and family life education, etc. The basic services provided for the migrant population. And this we term as the Model 1. But even with all those services provided, we feel that the cultural differences and particularly the community fragmentation and social exclusion still remains. Okay, so and we began to move on to the Model 2 with inclusive development. Community development informed by cultural asset approach, MBCD. The inclusive community development approach emphasized the importance of all cultural assets as an integrative mechanism in the migrant community in our in the community we're working. This practice bridges and accommodates the cultural differences between migrant groups and local residents, as well as active community networks and groups organized along cultural assets they possess. And this community mobilization organizing around the cultural assets of migrants and local residents help to activate their sentiments and their affection towards themselves, as well as to facilitate the empathetic understanding across migrant groups and local residents. And then in this, the emerging cultural identities provides a cultural nexus for social work intervention to integrate various aspects of community development, such as social network, community groups, social service provision, mutual help networks, community economy, and community participation. And this is a conceptual framework that we develop based on that. And basically, we have strategy of cultural asset mapping and mobilization using such local histories, legends, geographies, and also the histories of migration employment. Okay, and then strategy 2, we integrate culture and community economy. Okay, then we through that we actually set up like a platform using the mutual aid. Integrated, promoted to a community economy in constructing values of mutual aid, community exchange, collective consumption, indigenous and minorities cultures, and etc. Because of the time limit, I won't go into detail about that. And strategy 3, we use culture integrate community, inclusive community service and participation mechanism, such as social networks, resident groups being set up along cultural lines, and using the ethnicities and localities occupations. Okay, so basically, this Model 1 and Model 2 together integrated, we address the issues, okay, of bridging the cultural differences and inclusive community development, and also cultural sensitivity and cultivating cultural nexus of social work intervention, and bridging the bonding social capitals through cultural assets of ethnicity, reinforcing identity building and community organizing, and also bridging cultural social capital across the ethnic groups as well as local residents, reduce stereotyping, increase understanding and cooperation. And then in this way, multiple platforms of community engagement being set up, and also the in this way to achieve the inclusive community development. Because of this kind of like exploration, okay, together with the social workers on the ground, we think we're actually going to the a paradigm which is not necessarily new, but it's a paradigm of developmental social work that is social innovative and also socially inclusive and also socially integrated. And we have to say that almost more than since 2005, more than 16 years of the endeavor working with researchers together with the social workers on the ground. It hasn't been a very easy way, but we believe that the social workers working in the community needs new paradigm, okay, and to be more inclusive and also to achieve the sustainability. Yeah, this is about what. This is this is the end. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Rong. Dr. García?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good evening.
Am I over the time?
I hope you all can hear me okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you, and I'm very sorry that a COVID exposure has me participating via Zoom rather than in person, but if nothing else, COVID has taught us to be very flexible, so I appreciate the last-minute adjustment. At the University of Chicago, I am a sociologist of international migration. I specialize on the socio-legal inclusion and exclusion of undocumented Latin American immigrants in the contemporary United States. So to begin, I'd like to offer a sense of the scope of the issue. The United States has a very large and stable population of immigrants who lack legal authorization status. So after decades of growth, we reached an estimated peak of 12 million undocumented people in the US in the early 2000s. This population contracted slightly following the recession in 2008, 2009, and then rebounded. And so today we estimate about 11 million undocumented people are living in the United States, which makes up about a quarter of the total foreign-born population. So numbers are fairly stable and large, but there have been changes in the characteristics of this group. Mexican immigrants now make up a smaller, though still dominant share of the undocumented population at about 50%, though immigrants from Asia and Central America are now accounting for growing shares. Approximately 14% of the undocumented population is estimated to be from Asia and the United States, and of these, about 4% are from China and about 16% from Central America. Immigration status, of course, is an individually held status, but entire families are impacted. So, for example, about 4.4 million U.S. citizen children live in a household with at least one undocumented immigrant parent or adult caretaker. And when we think about these immigrant families, particularly those who have mixed immigration status, we know that about 26% of undocumented immigrants had family incomes below the federal poverty level. If we extend that out a bit, about 43% of undocumented immigrants have household incomes at 200% of the federal poverty level. So if we're thinking about inequality amongst this group and inclusion and exclusion, one of the first things to point out is that in many ways, poverty is shaped by a lack of legal recognition. And this is because holding an undocumented or an unauthorized or irregular immigration status means in the United States that you face limited employment options, the threat of immigration enforcement, and restrictions on eligibility for many federal public benefits, including cash welfare, food stamps, Medicaid or health care for those experiencing poverty, and Social Security or payments for the elderly, precisely the kinds of benefits and supports that one might need if they're facing limited employment options. And as the undocumented population in the United States enters middle age, questions of healthcare and elder care will become increasingly important. Also important is to consider how these exclusions at the federal level pair with extraction or the exploitation of labor via wage theft, unsafe working conditions, threats from employers of calling immigration enforcement if labor violations are filed and the like. And these situations lead to a common story of undocumented immigrant life in the shadows in the United States, where people who lack authorization status are so threatened and excluded that they avoid public life altogether, remaining shut inside with the door firmly closed. And there's some truth to this common depiction. We do see a chilling effect on undocumented immigrants' willingness to solicit services and programs that they or their U.S. citizens may be eligible for. The Urban Institute think tank tells us that in 2020, more than 1 in 3 adults in immigrant families with members who are not legal permanent residents reported avoiding a non-cash government benefit program or other help with basic needs because of concerns about immigration status or enforcement. And you can see how this is particularly problematic during COVID, when basic needs became so incredibly important for people who were cut off from their lines of work. But at the same time that we see this kind of system avoidance, my research indicates that this dominant depiction of undocumented immigrant life in the shadows is far too broad. It strips people of their agency, and it doesn't accurately portray everyday undocumented immigrant life. So in my work, I look at the impacts of holding undocumented immigration status from the perspectives of immigrants themselves. And this lens shows us that people without immigration status are indeed navigating the state and its systems of governance agentically and strategically. My work also indicates that as government extends and retracts rights and benefits and protections, it conveys messages to targeted immigrant groups that impact their engagement with the broader polity. And so in turn, undocumented and racialized immigrants have strong incentives to identify and engage government policies and programs that reduce the risks and the costs of interaction with the state. And so along these lines, to conclude, I want to offer some thoughts on promising policies and practices observed in my own work that might offer paths forward. So first, something promising, I think, on the short to intermediate term. Given exclusion from legal recognition and social safety net at the federal level, states, cities, and towns across the United States can foster local inclusion via their own set of immigration measures. For example, Chicago, alongside many other cities in the United States, have sanctuary ordinances that prohibit collaboration between local law enforcement and national immigration enforcement. To sort of toot the horn of Chicago and Illinois again, Illinois became the first state in the United States to extend healthcare coverage to undocumented people ages 65 or older who have incomes below the federal poverty level. This is critical, especially amid the pandemic that has disproportionately struck in low-income immigrant communities. These kinds of accommodating measures at the state and local level provide relative stability, relative protection, and foster inclusions and interactions between undocumented people and government systems. Finally, something promising on the long term. Full and legal social inclusion, I think, will only be attainable via a legalization program that will ensure the inclusion and socioeconomic mobility for undocumented people in the United States. We've seen positive impacts of this from our only amnesty program enacted in 1986, as well as scaled back programs like Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So I will stop here and thank you for your engagement and looking forward to questions and answers.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. Dr. Robinson?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Marci. Good evening, everyone. First, I want to begin by saying hello to all my students I see in the audience. I see you. Thank you for being here tonight. It is a pleasure to be in conversation with you all. I began my professional educational career as a high school teacher in the public schools in North Carolina, where I taught mostly United States history. And it was in these classrooms that I came to deeply understand the practical but real problems of teaching that were distant theories or anecdotes in my professional training. I had students who in the 11th grade were on 3rd grade reading levels. I had students who faced disproportionate expulsions and suspensions for typical adolescent behaviors. I also had students who scored level 5s on all of their advanced placement exams. And I had students who struggled with housing instability and periods of chronic homelessness. And it was this last group of students that I found the most difficult to assist in my role as teacher. How do I help them reach their full potentials when the governing structures and systems would rather veil their difficulties under a different social identity umbrella? And how do I help when their problems are so embedded in a larger ecosystem of inequity? And I'll come back to that in just a moment. So my current scholarly focus centers this last group of students, those faced with housing instability and periods of homelessness, sometimes with their families, and for older adolescents, often without anyone as an adult figure in their lives. I work with the Inclusive Economy Lab, a part of the urban labs here at the University of Chicago, and I'll refer to it as the IEL for brevity. But in my work with the IEL, we partner with Chicago Public Schools and other entities to investigate the educational experiences of school-aged children who are homeless or in temporary living situations. We know that Chicago has about 18,000 students who are living without stable housing or periods of chronic homelessness. And that is an undercount. There are tons of more students who we don't know are also facing periods of time where they do not have stable housing. We also know that only 1 out of every 5 households that qualify for housing assistance in Chicago are able to access it. We also know that the vast majority of students experiencing homelessness are considered ineligible for the limited number of permanent housing units provided through the continuum of care. Without stable housing, these young people face a tremendous uphill battle in reaching their educational aspirations and goals. They have lower GPAs, lower attendance rates, and are less likely to graduate high school than their similarly housed peers. For Chicago, about 85% of these 18,000 students are also Black or African American, which brings me back to my earlier comment about the veil. Students experiencing homelessness often have intersecting identities that are also marginalized in our society. They are often youth of color, often LGBTQIA+ students, and they're often poor. So I ask really important questions in my research. If educational credentialing remains the primary means of upward socioeconomic mobility, then how do we create educational spaces that sees, recognizes, and supports those who are veiled in all of these intersectional ways? I rarely begin my conversations about my research or about my work in schooling communities with the question of, should schools be doing this type of work? Homelessness is about poverty. It's about our capitalistic political economic system. And some people believe it's a private or an individual problem, and as such, so should the solution. Aren't those types of problems or issues beyond the scope of what schools can or should intervene in and try to mitigate? I believe that schools make the most sense as a place to begin and the first and most important to engage in issues of social inclusion and exclusion. Throughout history, the United States public school system has been the site of social progress. Schools have been the epicenter for progressive labor laws, economic growth, civil rights, and even the space race. As the pandemic has also highlighted, we can do amazing things. Our school systems can do amazing things and cater to the most marginalized and the neediest of students when the need arises. So we can do those things. Based on my research with IEL, schools have a critical role to play in ensuring the success of these young people. And I believe that Chicago Public Schools is leading the way in how to center these young people in policy and in practice. Now, none of this happens without the extensive, intentional inclusion of the young people themselves and their families who are dealing with housing instability. Only they can provide the deep, thoughtful, lived experiences that can lead to workable interventions for others who are like them. Because in the end, I too believe that education is the grand potential. That if we have the will, as a society, as a city, as a school district, that if we can identify, support, and make possible the capabilities and potential promise of every student, irrespective of their intersectional identities and social locations. And that inclusion, for me, is the one clear path for social equality on a broader scale. I'll end there, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Dr. Siu?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good morning. I'm Kaxton Siu, Associate Professor of the Department of Applied Social Sciences at the Kong Polytechnic University. Over the past 5 years, I have been one of the Hong Kong representatives in the tripartite collaborative initiative among University of Chicago, Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and China-speaking university promoting social policy and social work education in China that Gorman Smith just mentioned in the introduction. I'm very happy that I am invited to present one of my research projects in this forum. I'm a sociologist, and most of my research is about global migration and global labor. And today, I would like to share one of my research project, which is about the temporary labor migration and skill transfer from Japan to China and Vietnam. And I suppose all of you know that China is very ambitious over the past decade to upgrade its economy and also its position in global production and commodity chains. And notable examples include the Made in China 2025 plan. And that's why it is necessary for the Chinese government not only to acquire advanced technologies, but also to train a workforce with enough technical skills in different industries. And it is exactly against this background that address the importance of this research, because China now cannot easily or directly acquire technology and technical skills from the United States, then the Chinese government needs to seek other country options. And it is Japan, which still have quite a large number of foreign direct investment in China, that the Chinese government is cooperating with for this national goal. And similarly, in Asia, apart from China, Vietnam, after 30-something years of economic reform, is also under great pressure to upgrade its economy to catch up with other neighboring countries. At the same time, Japan, we all know, is an aging society, is lacking of youthful working population. And since 2016, Japan's foreign workforce has exceeded 1 million. And about 20% of them come from Japan's temporary labor migration program, the so-called Technical Intern Training Program. Its abbreviation is TITP program. And surprisingly, 70% of these migrants come from China and Vietnam. So in the literature about international labor migration and skill transfer, one line of thought suggests that there is indeed some skill transfer between the countries, from developed countries to developing countries. But another line of thought actually suggests that a lot of these programs are just side off for importing cheap labor, and there is no skill transfer. And based on the literature, actually, a lot of discussion has been generated about Japan's migration program, and quite a lot of them thinks that this program fails to achieve its stated objective to transfer skills to developing countries like China and Vietnam. That means, despite ambitious plan for Chinese government to have skill transfer from Japan, it seems that there's still a lot of barriers for the Chinese government to overcome, and that's why this study tries to take this as the starting point to further examine why this migration program failed. And there are three basic questions asked in this research. First, how the involvement of government of the labor sending country, that means the Chinese government and the Vietnamese government, can mediate the whole migration process. Second, why international skill transfer between China, Vietnam, and Japan fails. And third, from the perspective of inequality and equity, what problems have been triggered under the migration program, and also how can these problems can be addressed. And I used two national cases, Vietnam and China, and each of the countries actually have two different recruitment channels to recruit migrant trainees to Japan. For Vietnam, most of the recruiters are the private intermediate transnational agencies. For China, actually the Chinese government actively involved in the recruitment and the placement process. So in terms of my data, I empirically look at how these migrant trainees perceive their migration experience and how the migrant families' socio-economic background, especially their human capital, affect their the skills before and after their departure, and whether the migrants actually gain any skills and enhance their skills during this program. Okay, so actually we select three different field sites: one in China in Hangzhou City, another one is Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and also the Shizuoka Prefecture in Japan. And the fieldwork has been conducted since 2017. And the selection of these locations are quite strategic because all these locations are almost a cluster of most of these migrants, especially in Shizuoka Prefecture. That is one of the major migrant receiving prefecture in Japan. So talking about my findings, first, about the recruitment arrangement to Japan, I found that actually Vietnamese trainees under private intermediate agents have to pay a large amount of unauthorized or unauthorized charges, and most of them have to borrow a lot of money in order to go overseas to Japan. This makes them have to become a bonded labor in Japan because they have to repay a lot of loan to the bank or their relatives. For Chinese trainees, usually they were recruited under the government-involved channel, and most of them are actually very elite students graduated from the technical vocational schools and at least have 1 year of on-site production training experience in factories before they departed to Japan. But very surprisingly, both the Vietnamese and Chinese migrants staying in Japan face a lot of labor and human rights violation. And the top violation is non-payment of wages to these migrants. And the situation happens most seriously to these Vietnamese trainees and migrants. And most of them have to go to work underground in black market in Japan, and which makes them illegal citizens or having no identity in Japan and cannot go back to Vietnam. So and also apart from wrong payment, safety and health issues also cause a very high rate of violation. Another violation is very long working hours, and most of the Chinese and Vietnamese migrants have to work from 11 to 12 hours a day. And particularly for Chinese migrants, due to their lack of Japanese language training, they even cannot communicate with their co-workers. And of course, because of this, they also cannot learn a lot from the skills training program. But comparatively speaking, we find that Chinese migrants live better than the Vietnamese trainee. They still can be housed in a dormitory with enough space, but for the Vietnamese trainees, they have to be crowded in a very small unit. So, and then it comes to the second question, why this kind of migration program fails? And I found that there are 4 reasons. First, because Vietnamese migrants, most of them come from very poor rural families, and they want to make quick money. But contrastingly, Chinese trainees were elites, and some of them are quite wealthy graduates, and they consider going to Japan as self-investment and hope to get into management positions after their training. Second, for Vietnamese government, especially for local and provincial government, sending migrants to Japan is also actually a strategy for poverty reduction. But for China, it is the opposite. They think that it is a way to upgrade the industry, to build a larger goal, to build a stronger nation. Third, Vietnamese trainees usually complain that actually after they receive training from Japan, when they go back to Vietnam, there is what I call the ethnic glass ceiling in those transnational companies. That means they cannot be promoted beyond the production line level. Okay, so actually for the Chinese trainee, they have the age glass ceiling. That means they are discriminated, and most of the managerial positions were occupied by the middle-aged workers. So as a summary, actually, about the equity and inequality issues, through my study, I found that not only migrants, they were having age and ethnicity obstacles to advance their career, but also there is also a great disparity between work and living conditions between local workers and migrant workers in destination countries. And most of the time, labor and human rights violation of these migrant workers cannot be addressed, and there's no local NGOs or regulatory body to monitor these issues. Although international labor organizations have different regulatory protocols to ask local government to exercise in order to protect the rights of migrant workers or trainees. But a lot of times, these violations were conducted by private recruitment agencies, which is transnational, and were not abided by any laws of the migrant sending or receiving countries. So it creates quite a big loopholes for different exploitations to happen. Finally, especially for the discipline of social work, I think we have to think a little bit more about just providing social service to local people. Because for people like international migrants, actually, they were quite vulnerable in this aspect. And usually their equity issue and also their welfare issues cannot be addressed adequately. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. That was wonderful. I'm going to open up the audience in a bit. I just wanted to share with you some of my observations from these 4 great talks. I heard a lot about push and pull, both at kind of local level, community level, but also in industries that folks are working in, and the ways in which not only nation states, but at the local level and here in the US at the state level, that policies matter, right? And that at different times in folks' lives, they're facing those policies that are critically important to them. So I was really struck by some of the references to when it matters for children versus when it matters for folks who are working age versus when it's going to matter for folks as they're aging. And at all of those different points in time, we would expect that different types of policy provisions matter. in really critical ways. And so for me, I enjoyed the talks in the sense that it helped me think much more critically across the life course rather than just thinking of migrants, folks who are immigrating, or inclusion exclusive policies more broadly. I think thinking about it from at what juncture in someone's life they might be is incredibly useful. And so I wanted to ask our panelists, before we opened it up to the audience, knowing that you listened in as well, any of your insights in thinking kind of across the scholarly work that you do of things that are challenges in the country that you focus on versus things that you think might be promising that you heard.
So maybe I take off one question. Can I?
Please.
So I heard from the second presenter that is also working on migration issues about undocumented migrants in the United States. Because my research is also about migrants in Japan, I found that there is quite a few initiatives in Japan trying to address the welfare issues in Japan. So I wonder if there is any insights that can be learned from the United States, whether there can be some new policy that can be generated as an example for Asian countries.
Thank you. I also very much enjoyed your talk, everyone's talk, really. There's a lot of synergies here. I think to answer your question and to sort of build off of what Professor Ybarra has put on the table for us to discuss, I would say that because the United States has a largely laissez-faire approach to immigrant integration at the national level, that is to say we don't do much at the national level, and leave that for states and localities to either take on or not. That one question that might arise if Asian countries are looking to the United States as a potential model or not, a lesson to be learned, is to think about what happens when you get a patchwork of different kinds of policies. So the national level government doing one thing, a regional government or a state government or a municipality doing something else, and how that might contribute to inequality when we look at the larger picture. So while in my work, undocumented people arguably have an easier time of it in a state like Illinois and a city like Chicago, that doesn't bode well for undocumented people in states and cities that are less receptive. And so when we look at inequality amongst immigrants as a whole in the country, that patchwork comes into play. To Professor Ybarra's question about what we might learn from each other, I was taken by Professor Robinson's comments about housing for students who are struggling with homelessness in Chicago public schools. And it made me think about working across systems. For example, what would housing look like for students in Chicago public schools who are in mixed immigration status households and experiencing poverty but are restricted from accessing some federal supports for housing. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. Any of the other panelists care to comment before we move to the audience? Okay, thank you. We'll open it up to the audience if there are burning questions for our panelists. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm really excited to hear what Professor Robinson has said, and I'm so glad that you mentioned Chicago, whereas the local problem is, what we really care about so much, especially, I would say, this year more than ever, or the past 2 years since the pandemic. And I was born in Beijing, but I've lived in Chicago for over a decade now. So obviously, I see myself as a Beijing Chicagoan. So I think you mentioned that you believe the school can play a bigger role in the society, and I think I agree with you too. There's just one couple years ago, I saw like a television video to show the very rural parts of China. The students go to school, they have to like climb mountains for like 2 hours until they can get to school. But they only do that on a weekly basis, which means that once they get to the school would provide, the dorm and the food and everything, and they stay at school. So which means they have to be at school. They're not letting the students out, for the entire week. They can go home on the weekends. So even they may not get nutrition on the weekend, but during this 5-day, the school days, the students are covered with everything provided, and they don't get drugs there in China. There was no drugs problem, and also their attendance is 100%, which means because they don't let students out of the school. Well, of course, you can argue that in the U.S. that you want freedom for everything, right? But I'm just thinking, because for kids, what's your opinion about create a system for public school for the unfortunate families that their kids can be in school, but in the school have this kind of similar structure to help them so they can finish their high school. Therefore, without all those problems outside of the school, so kind of make the school kind of like I would say, safety nest for them.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Chicago's lucky to have you here as a resident. That's an interesting intervention. What would the school's responsibilities be if it decided to become a space that houses young people instead of the traditional 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and then send them home? And it brings up a whole slew of other issues. Infrastructure. Where do we have these students eat and sleep during that time period? Who's responsible for their discipline and care? And given the dispersed bureaucracy of our school systems, who's going to ultimately be responsible for those young people during the weeks and the times that they're away from their parents? Because in our system, parents are still responsible even when students are in the school. So when students are disobedient or they misbehave, we'll often say, "Oh, well, your mother has to come in right now. Your caregiver has to come into the space and mediate this conversation." And we have a traditional culture here in the United States when it comes to what we will and will not allow our children to do. And in some cultures in the United States, sending your child away for 10, 15 years of schooling is very common and is expected. And yet for the large amount of people, for the majority of people, that's sort of unheard of. It's giving the state sort of control over raising your child. And as we can see with the discussions about critical race theory going on around the country, around sex education and driver's education, basically anything, parents are very critical of the state raising their children in any way. And because of those different ideas of what schools should be, we have over 15,000 school districts here in the United States. How do we make sure students in one school district are getting an equitable education in terms of other school districts? We don't. And we often say that's not what we're supposed to be doing. So we haven't gotten to a place in this country where we say this is the purpose of public education, and it's a common purpose amongst all 50 states and territories. And until we get there, I'm afraid getting to a consensus of let's house students who really need a safe, stable place to live, we can't even begin to get there. But I look forward to conversations that hopefully get us to a place where we don't have to house students when their schools are 3 blocks away. We have homeless students who are 3 blocks away from the schools and can't get there because of other obstacles and challenges. So if we could start there, we can have broader conversations about what else can we be doing to make sure schools are attentive to the most marginalized amongst us. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. So, question here?
Can you hear? Okay, hello everyone. My name is Jaden. I'm actually one of the Dr. Robinson students for this quarter. We have gone through many wonderful lectures from different perspectives about educations here. And thank you so much for your first round conversation. I think it's opened up a very good platform on which we talk about the responsibilities of the schools, particularly for the adolescents, and not only for the adolescents, but also for this under 18 or under 18 years, the youth. I was just wondering, you mentioned that the critical role for school for addressing the social inequality, which I definitely agree. But I just wonder, do you think that it's probably there's like an overemphasis on the responsibilities of the schools? Because somehow my feeling is that to alleviate the students from poverty or housing is not only the power of schools are not enough. Maybe there is a need for the higher structural adjustment, and whether the schools possess adequate resources to address all these problems. And if not, then where can we see the implementation from the higher decisional level to help the schools to solve these problems?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jaden, for that question. Schools are in a unique position in almost every geographic space in the United States, mainly because they touch all constituents in a given space. They touch all citizens. And one of the common things about most people in the United States is that they've had some sort of contact and connection with the public school in some way. And if it's not public school, it's a private school, charters and magnets. The wonderful thing about schools is because they connect with particularly young children, they also connect with their families. So when I say schools play a critical role in solving social inequalities and social inequities, part of that is that schools touch more people than most of our other social inequality systems. People are excluded from the healthcare systems in very predominant ways. People are excluded or included in the criminal justice system in very pejorative ways, right? So schools touch people and touch their children on a broad scale. So if we want to really get at the issues of poverty, intersectional poverty, get at issues, I would say even issues of race and class, you start with the schools because they touch the children and they touch the families. If we're worried about people falling into poverty or falling into homelessness, because some people are, as they say, one paycheck away, most teachers can identify that very quickly. They're spending huge amounts of time with young people. They're connecting with family members, hopefully regularly. So why not use that as a connector to other health and human services organizations outside of schools? Mm-hmm. Schools can play that mediating role. They don't have to provide housing to every child and family who needs it, even though I argue that we should. That's me, right? Let's just give housing to people. And anyone who knows me knows that's not a very, it's not radical for me to say that, it's sort of me. But they can get people the resources they need in the space and time in which they need them. And they can advocate for the most needy, most marginalized people in a school community, which sometimes you have broad diversity in class and socioeconomic systems in a school district. What if we center those with the most need? What if every school district centered those young people the most in their policies, in their programming, in the way that they reached out to neighboring school districts and say, hey, we have these students who are struggling in these ways, how can we help? And if that's where we begin, I think there's a potential for us to grab the plus 18,000 students that we don't know about. Because we know if we know about 18,000, how many do we not know about? And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I think it raises a broader question that I was thinking through when I heard everyone speaking. I'm going to direct this towards Dr. Rong, which is that there's an institutional role. And we've been talking a lot about the institutional role of education. And I think it crosses all of the scholars who are speaking today, which is most folks who are studying or scholars of immigration or migration are studying families predominantly. And that families are oftentimes folks with young children. And so folks with young children are going to send their kids to schools. And so it makes sense that education or educational as an institution would be a productive place to have an intervention. And so one way I think of that is like if you have kids who are whose parent might be undocumented, we know that if schools hold dental clinics and checkups and things of that nature, that it reduces the chilling effects of kids of undocumented parents getting health education. So for Dr. Rong, you talked a lot about the role of social workers, right, as a kind of factor in bridging cultural gaps and developing cultural assets. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to the audience about what are the institutional roles in that, meaning are they connected to nonprofits? Are they connected to schools? Are they connected to other institutions that buttress those kinds of interventions or that are important to families that we might be able to learn from relative to the work that you're doing?
Okay, thanks. Yes. Yeah, all the actually issues addressed with children in schools, both in the countryside, in the rural area, and also in the cities. Okay, there remains a gap with so-called educational quality or educational equity. Okay, so and due to the we talk about the system that household registration, this system, although it's been, I would say, over the years of the policy, the policy it's being lessened, the gap between the urban and the rural. Okay, but I would say the gap still remains. And that's why with social workers, they helping to bridge the gap, for providing the kind of social service, okay, for the children and the family. Okay, so that's why we use this kind of integrated approach while working with children in schools and also with the families, and also with the community center together. And in this way, we are also able, while providing the service, we also find that some policies, although it's been changed at the policy level, but in implementing, there still remains a gap. So that's why social workers working at the community level also help to improve the policy. That, for example, the policy at the beginning for the migrant children to enter the state-run schools was not available. So, and in our cases, when we find the difficulties of children always in the so-called private schools with educational qualities that was not very good for them. So we promote the policy that we began to do the policy advocacy. So, and in the end, not just at the very so-called macro level, but also in the city level, that this policy changed, that the rural migrant children are able to go into the schools. So this is kind of like, I would say, the model we're trying to develop is like integrating the micro and also the policy level together, from top down and also bottoms up. And so, but in this way, we also help work with the children, the families, to voice out their needs and concerns through our so-called empowerment model. Yeah. So this is like the process we're actually working to help to change the policy environment, but at the same time with the children and the families in the cities. But it is, I would say, it's rather complicated we have such a huge population actually coming to the city and changing the whole map of the whole population structure of China. Okay, so there are rural areas. In the rural areas, we have so-called left behind children, left behind women, left behind elderly. Okay, we have those three so-called left behind. So the Chinese government trying to do something about it. For example, with most of the families with the adults into the city, and with the remaining children and the elderly, it's difficult for them to take care of the children. That's why they have this centered sort of a schooling for children. And then at least in this way, they will guarantee some kind of quality education, but also quality sort of like safety for the children. But that poses another question: is we know that the children always grow up better in the families. Okay, that's the best place for their socializing with their cultures. Especially with the minority cultures, they learned from the families interacting with the immediate guardians more. So are we losing that some kind of a tradition in this whole process? Why we think we're providing the better quality education for children. So this is something actually we are actually struggling with. And but in the long run, we think this requires different models, different ways of addressing the issues, or the issues that can be like most acute issue, or the issues that are the long-term issues. So this is something I think we're still trying to balance, basically, why and the children or family and their best, I would say, protected, but at the same time, there's not just like population, but a human being, but also culturally, and that's why we call it the culturally inclusive is important. Basically. Yeah. Thank you.
Much. Is there another question from the audience? I see someone's hand up there. And then next would be the person in, I think it's a pink blouse. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for all the discussion that you all have brought to this talk tonight. I have two questions that I find really interesting comparatively when thinking about the US and China. The first is about indigeneity and indigenous rights. Obviously, like historically, the US and China differ a lot with regard to how long they've been in occupation of the territories that they currently define within their borders. And then relatedly, so I'm curious to hear a little bit about indigenous rights and indigenous inequalities and how they might be thought of differently in the two countries. Secondly, connecting to that, but also thinking about migration, which has been such a big theme tonight, I'm curious how language access and language rights are conceived of. I have one really good friend from Sichuan, and he described growing up the shift in policy where his teachers were no longer allowed to speak the Sichuan dialect in schools. And that reminds me also of a lot of different issues that we have with language access in schools in the United States. And so I'm curious if there is an orientation toward, first of all, national language policy, maintaining linguistic diversity for both national minorities and also migrants, and then how those rights are respected or given access to in these institutional settings such as education. Thank you.
Fantastic questions. Thank you so much. Would any of our panelists like to take that up first?
Well,
I guess okay, go ahead.
I'll be very brief. I wanted to say those were excellent questions, and I wanted just to make a response on the question about language access. In the United States, sort of in the every person on the street corner kind of perception of who immigrants are, the kind of responses you're going to get are people from Latin America who speak Spanish. Now, that's partially true, but I've also shared with you that our flows are changing. And we have increasing shares of undocumented immigrants from Asia and Central America, which means that we need to get a lot better at language access in the United States beyond the English and Spanish, which has become fairly common, though not present in every space that it might need to be. For example, when we look at the estimated numbers of people who were eligible for deferred action for childhood arrivals, which is a temporary protection program for young people who came to the United States without documentation status as minors, we think that the numbers of people who applied for that program who come from countries that don't have Spanish or English as a primary language are very low. And we think that part of the reason why we see depressed uptake amongst those populations is because there are not as many social service agencies or nonprofit advocacy agencies that are helping these communities learn about the program and apply for it in a language that they can understand. So as we see our undocumented population start to diversify in terms of home languages, that's going to be a huge implication for our policies and programs going forward to accommodate those languages.
Thank you, Dr. García. Dr. Rong, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, just a little bit. Yes, this is we do have in China in policy on the language. But basically, they could in that school. But the thing is that we have the examination, entrance examination to the university that is only the Mandarin, only the the Mandarin, and that makes the families, even with young children, beginning to have the children to learn the standardized the language, the national language, and that make it kind of difficult for the children to continue to have not just the children but to the schools to implement the language linguistic diversity. So this is something that's why the social workers in the community, especially with the summer schools and the winter schools, they will adopt the language. We're working with minority groups to with the culture and language, and in the community centers run by the social workers. So it's pretty much a common practice, at least in the area working. Yunnan is very we have most diverse ethnic groups. So our social workers will do that, trying to actually help to address this issue a little. But institutionally, it is kind of difficult to keep that, to implement that policy, as long as we have only the Mandarin, the language, to be taken as entry examination to enter the college. Yeah, but that's an issue. Yeah, I'll let you add a little. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
May I ask Dr. Rong? Dr. Rong, I have a question about the social workers. Did I hear correctly that in 2012, China implemented the social work career path for people and said we need to get more social workers in the country to deal with some of these social problems, and that now you have over 1 million social workers? So in 10
I would
years,
say I use the term actually starting from 2006. Yeah, and the government policy already promotes that we will develop a huge, so-called army of social workers. So it started from 2006, and but up to now, there's more than 1.5 million social workers. But I use the term social workers and parasocial workers, even community workers. So these three terms are still very much kind of mixed in China. So it's not necessary. It's not all like social workers we understand in U.S. Okay, you go through this professional training, very vigorously, and with all those practice, everything that's required. that's social workers. For that group, still remains quite. I want to say that the data is still quite low. I guess it's only like 47,000 around that. Okay, but then we do have a lot of people working in that role, like taking care of the people, taking care of children and family. Okay, in a way not necessarily that professional, but they are actually filling the roles that's required by them. And so we're still sort of like sorting that out. Who are social workers? Okay, are they just the social workers trained from the college to be called to be termed as social workers? All the ones that actually are doing the work are actually meeting the needs of the people, but in a way that is, I would say, systematically sort of developing. Okay, and so this is a mixed kind of things that still need to work on. Yeah.
And do you know of the percentage of that entire army of people who are doing this work? What percentage are from the ethnic minorities in China?
The percentage is, I would say, still. I mean, it's still very low. Still very low. Yeah. So that's why. For me, okay, working in our area, okay, it's on the border to different countries like Vietnam and Myanmar and Laos, and that we have about 23 ethnic groups in our area. Okay, so over the years, almost the past 10 years, we've been helping to recruit the ethnic, I would say, the young people back to their rural areas, okay, to train them from the ground, and then to actually in this way they're able to integrate basically with their own ethnic cultures and together with so-called professional knowledge. So this is something we're actually helping to develop. Right now we have helped to develop about 12 ethnic social workers. Okay, they are from the ethnic themselves. But in terms of like numbers, still very low. I won't say it's not up to the even percentage yet. Okay, but this is an issue that we began to acknowledge and begin to work to see how quickly we can develop this ethnic or ethnically aware or sensitive or even the culturally, I would say, very embedded kind of social workers. Yeah, we're still working on that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rong. I think there is a question right here. Yes, please.
Yes, hello. My name is Joyce. I'm a first-year undergraduate at the college. I have a question for... Oh, thank you so much for coming, all of you today. I have a question for Professor García. So regarding illegal immigrants, you talked about how a solution to, I guess, improving their lives was giving them legalization into the country. And I was just wondering if you could explain more specifically how exactly that process would happen, specifically regarding the subsidization of, giving them this legal access to being an immigrant to America, like giving them maybe an American passport, like making them a citizen, how that would work, who would pay for it, and how that would work and coincide with actual immigrants who are applying legally. Do illegal immigrants have precedent over those people who applied legally, or is it just how would that work? Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Joyce. Thank you for your question. With all of these issues, the devil's in the details, and we don't know how it would work because we haven't done it since 1986, and things have radically shifted since 1986. And so, I can tell you about how our failed efforts at comprehensive immigration reform have gone, which is not well because they failed, but I think one of the reasons, or one of the ways that we are thinking about comprehensive immigration reform has to do with what folks call a grand bargain. And so this is in order to get everybody at the table and to get legislation passed. The way that we've approached comprehensive immigration reform is for Democrats to concede to Republicans to have stronger border controls and stronger interior enforcement. And alongside with that comes more restrictions and sanctions on employers who hire people without authorized status to work. And then the Republicans hand off to the Democrats a legalization program. That's the bargain. That's the bargain that we thought would get legislation past the line, and so far it hasn't. So one of the things that concerns me, sort of looking forward into a crystal ball, is whether or not we're stuck in kind of a path-dependent loop where every time we propose comprehensive immigration reform in the United States, we are offering up this grand bargain that thus far, since 1986, well, we tried it, I'll say at least 3 times we've come very, very close to passing comprehensive immigration reform. And each time it's fallen through, in part because this bargain is not making anyone happy. So to your question about how we would pay for it and who would come first and who would come second, I think all of these questions are up in the air. And most likely, in terms of who would pay for the application process, that would most likely fall on the shoulders of people that were applying to legalize. Right now, for example, DACA, to reauthorize yourself under the DACA program, it costs $500 every 2 years. So I'm assuming a lot of the charges, just in terms of processing, would be shouldered by people that were applying to regularize their status. And of course, the American economy would grow quite a bit if we allowed people to enter the formal labor market in a legalized way. All this is to say is that most economists, when we look at trade-offs between what people put into the system and what people take out of the system, most folks think it's basically a wash. And we think that legalization would be a net benefit in terms of socioeconomic standing for both immigrants and most likely the larger communities around them.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you so much for presenting. Yasmin Juarez Harris, MPP. And my question is for Professor XIANG Rong. I studied abroad in China fall of 2018, spring of 2019. And during spring break, we took a trip to Yunnan, where we lived with in Mapingwang village. It's a village of less than 17 households. And we had conversations with them about the poverty alleviation. And we noticed that there were a lot of 20 to 30-year-olds. And so many of them actually had been in a bigger city and then moved back to their hometown due to tourist opportunities. And I'm wondering if this is an overall trend in China. And if so, what percentage of migrant workers are returning to their hometowns? And could you talk a little bit about the average time that workers spend outside of their hometowns? And I also had a question for Professor Siu, if there's time. There's a similar program between Japan and Brazil. It happened in the early 2000s, around 2005, 2007, with ethnic Japanese in Brazil. But this program had some sort of pathway to residency, and I'm wondering if this would be at all attractive for Chinese workers or Vietnamese workers who migrate to Japan for work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. Yes, I would say that it's been a while that when we call to migrants are the peasant workers. We will use the term peasant workers. Those means that they work in the urban area, they migrate to the city, but they always return back home in the village. Okay, so there's both peasant and workers. Seems like the double identities. Okay, especially is for the different. We say I agree with the life sort of like a course kind of framework to look at this population. And for the older generation, like the ones like in their 50s or even 60s, after they spend some time in the cities, they're always looking back and would expect themselves to return to the rural areas. So this is being wild, like with different age group in the city and going back. But this is changing. The whole landscape is changing for the past, I would say, 5 years because of also the policy. And now, the whole country is thinking under this rapid urbanization, are we just to be all urbanized without any rural areas at all? And the China believe that this shouldn't be the road that we're taking on to the so-called urbanization. So starting from like as you said, the anti-poverty alleviation or poverty alleviation program for the past 5 years, the more policy, more actual resources being actually channeled to the rural areas. And now, even with 5 more years or even in the 10 years to come, will be even more endeavors. So that brings some young people going back, not just the middle-aged or elderly people that for the earlier generation, the young people going back to do some kind of like, especially with the areas with tourism industry, okay, development, and the more and more young people return. This is the trend, I would say, and so that's why we are able to help to develop the rural social work development because of the young people, especially with some college education, going back to help with the rural area to develop. So this is not just economically, but also culturally and socially. Okay, and this is in the years to come, we can see that the rural area might be able to have more young people to return. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So regarding your question about Chinese or Vietnamese people staying in Japan to get the passport to stay there, actually it is quite difficult because we know that Japan is quite a closed society, not welcoming, one of the most closed society, not welcoming foreigners. And for the migration program, actually it is quite tricky in the terms that they use, the Japanese government use. They do not term it as a migration program, actually. They term it as a training program. So that's why it is a temporary migration program. And all the migrants, actually, they were only granted for 3 years of staying in Japan, and upon further review for longer staying. That means actually Japanese society is still not welcoming these people, but they need their labor power. So that's why the tricky thing is they want their labor power, but at the same time they don't want them to stay long in the society. The biggest problem actually comes from those undocumented Vietnamese migrants because most of them cannot earn enough money in their formal training program, so they need to work underground in the black market and subsequently become the undocumented citizens in Japanese society. And more seriously, because they can stay for quite long and have their second generation, then it triggers another big problem about how these second generation live and also their education problem. And if their parents were caught and being deported back to Vietnam or China, then how is the status of these children? Then we don't know about this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one final question from the audience. Please.
Thank you for presenting. My name is Rose Mabwa. I'm a professional who works in affordable housing. My question is directed to Dr. Zhang. Can you share with us, you shared with us that how China has implemented a very aggressive social workers training program. Can you share with us how in 2020 and 2021 during COVID, whether China's mental health has increased or decreased, and how has the program helped?
Okay, that's a good question. And I would say under the COVID-19, the mental health problems has been increased a lot. Okay, especially with families with young adults, and especially with those children at home, and also together with the family issues. Okay, so the mental health problems has been increased and been seen, and that's why social workers now being trained. I would say still not up to the the kind of like needs yet. Okay. And the very vigorous programs being trained at different levels, from national and also provincial and prefectures. And then last year, there's one policy from the Ministry of Civil Affairs that all the township level in China must have a social work, so-called station, okay, in the 3 years to come. So that's a total, that is making social workers, although it's been developed in China for over 10 years, but it's still very much, I would say, compared with the kind of needs, and also with it's a whole new idea, whole new sort of like mindset to look at people, although we've been talking about human-centered, all that kind of thing. That means a change in the whole mindset, and working from the bottom up. And the training programs being very vigorous at different levels, and also the system, the policy systems is being sort of like very systematically made. But I would say the knowledge or the skills being taught at different levels still remains a problem. Okay, we're still struggling what kind of knowledge and skills that should be taught. And there's a still gap in between the college sort of taught knowledge and the knowledge that being practiced, being used. There still remain the gap. That's why we talk about action research or practice knowledge, okay, filling the gap. But still, the gap is still very huge. So, and it might be many years to fill that gap. But still, how to have the kind of training program that is bottom up, and also the professional or the researchers working closely with the ground sort of like social workers together to generate the kind of knowledge to work together. It's very, very, very urgent. But it's still not, the whole system is still not being put together yet. We call that co-knowledge production. Okay, still not all complete yet. We're still moving into that direction. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that final question and bringing in the incredibly important and contemporary issue of the pandemic. We are unfortunately out of time. I hope that everyone has enjoyed the panel. I know I learned a tremendous amount, and that these are global issues of inequality and inequity that we can learn from each other from. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity to do so. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists, along with our fantastic audience for tonight's event.
I want to also add my thanks to all of our speakers tonight. It's so great to see those who are in person and those who are on video, as well as all of the speakers who were here last night and the night before for providing their insights on an array of social policy issues. There are no shortage of problems and opportunities for us to address, and I'm excited about the potential of our continued work together. I'd like to also thank the China-United States Exchange Foundation for their support, as well as the incredible teams at the Crown Family School and UChicago Global for organizing this event. Finally, I want to thank all of you for being here, particularly those who have been here all 3 nights, late into the night. We're very excited to have you here and appreciate you spending time with us. And I would like to invite you, those of you who are in the room with us, to join us for the closing reception, again, outside these doors. It'll be in the lobby. As a reminder, for those of you who are vaccinated, you can remove your mask to eat and drink, and those who are unvaccinated can do the same, but we'll need to maintain 6 feet of social distance. You all know the drill by now. So many thanks to all of you again, and I'll see you outside this room.